Okay, we're on.
So, so after starting King of the Hill, I had been supervising. I had a deal at Fox, and I had been supervising other people who were running the show. And then I came back to run it in like season 7, and then handed it off again, like in season 8. And when you're not physically running a show, you have a lot more time, but it's a little frustrating because you're not actually able to necessarily influence things. It depends on the politics of the environment. And so I ended up around season 9 of King of the Hill with not being involved in the show so much, and looking for my next project. And I met with Henson about maybe redoing the Muppets, and I had a bunch of other projects. And my agent sent me a tape called The Office, and like around November or something, and he said, "This is something I want you to look at. Maybe you could do that." And I didn't really look at it until like the last day of Christmas vacation, and he had emailed me saying, "Please give me a yes or no. I want to go on to the next person on my list." This was Ari, and so I watched it like on a Sunday night, and I ended up watching the entire first season, and I was completely, blown away by it. I thought it was fantastic, and again, it was a situation where I just wanted to meet those guys that had created that show because I didn't understand really how they did it, and it was so cool. And in the same way that I just wanted to pitch to Larry David or something like that, or work with Jim Brooks, I really wanted to meet Ricky Gervais and Stephen Merchant. So they were in town in February, and I went and had a meeting with them, with Ben Silverman at Reveille, and we got along great. They loved The Simpsons. They were huge Simpsons fans, and their favorite Simpsons episode was Homer Bad Man, which was one of the ones that I had done. And, and we talked about The Office, and I talked about all the kind of writing principles and theories that I had from King of the Hill in terms of realism and poignancy and stuff that really was similar to the voice of The Office, I thought. And so, we gradually negotiated, and I was going to do the American remake. And at the time, the British one was not airing anywhere in America, and when I agreed to do it, and then it started to air in America, and everybody in the comedy world realized how great it was, and it put a lot of pressure, because when you think about, say, All in the Family, nobody had seen the English show that you were talking about, Till Death Do Us Part, that it was based on in America. I haven't seen it. I don't even know if it's available. So he didn't have to worry about people comparing it to the original, whereas Coupling had just aired, which was a American remake of a British show, and had been criticized a lot. So there was a lot of pressure with remaking The Office. But I was so confident with how cool the material was, and it was like a great magnet for other people who loved it. Like John Krasinski loved it, and really wanted to work on the show, and just the other cast members who were drawn to the material, and I really wanted to get Allison Jones to cast it, who had cast Freaks and Geeks, and she loved the material too, and so the material was like a good magnet for talented people. I'm just sort of telling the whole story of the show. So we had to figure out a place to sell it, and I guess I had assumed it would go to cable because it was very unlike the prevailing TV shows. Like the biggest hit on NBC at the time was Will and Grace, which was multi-camera and didn't feel like The Office at all. And to me, I felt like I was perfectly in the zone for The Office, having just finished 9 years of King of the Hill, which is single camera and has a tone of that I thought was similar. But it didn't seem like something that was on network. But Kevin Riley really liked it, and he had been on FX, so we kind of thought we were going to sell it to FX, but then he became the president of NBC, and he still wanted it. And at that point, you know, I hadn't worked with him. I was a little distrustful that the NBC version of The Office would be faithful to what I loved about the show. So when it was time to do the pilot, I stayed very close to the original script. I Americanized it and did some changes to it. Maybe like a third of it was new, but or more, but some in terms of, but the basic structure wasn't, and the tone wasn't, and we ended up cutting a lot of the new material because I overwrote it. Anyway, regardless, to me the big challenge was could I produce something that had the same flavor as the original, and it was hard to figure out how they did it too. And I don't know, when it came out, like, you know, it didn't seem like something that was in the wheelhouse of any people, any cameramen, any directors, any actors. You know, it seemed very unique. So the first hires that I made after Allison Jones was Ken Kwapis, who had directed the pilot of Larry Sanders. And again, big, important show for me, Larry Sanders. I thought he would get it, and, you know, he obviously did, and we had a lot of conversations about how to pull it off. And, you know, and then Ben had suggested Steve Carell for the lead. And, but he suggested it right before we had hired Allison, and I was like, great. You know, I saw the clip from Bruce Almighty. I think he's great. Let's just hire Allison, the casting director. And in the 10 days that it took to get her deal done, Steve took another show. And then, you know, which was a big setback. And then we embarked on a giant 3-month casting campaign to try and figure out who would be Michael Scott. And, you know, and we had the luxury of casting outside of the normal pilot process. So we saw just everybody in town. And then we shot screen tests, because I had tried to cast before with multi-camera, and the normal way you present people is you bring them into a tiny theater at the network, and then they have to do the stuff in front of a bank of unsmiling TV executives. And it really selects for a very theatrical kind of performer who loves the attention and is doing big, loud stuff. And this show was not supposed to be that kind of thing. It was more single camera. It was finding moments and blowing them up, and being like a more internal, realistic acting. And it would have been terrible to try and bring them and put them on a little stage. So we shot screen tests, and we shot many days of screen tests where all the contenders for the different roles came in. And I had them go through improv games. Like, one of the games was we had we had Dwight, whoever was trying out for Dwight, sitting at his chair, and the gym candidates brought him a glass of water that he didn't ask for and just gave it to him. And then Dwight would be very, like, suspicious about why Jim was bringing him water when he didn't ask for it. And you know, they would play these games like that. And Rainn Wilson was like the clear front runner for Dwight. And John Krasinski, who I met for the first time in New York casting, he came and did screen tests, and he was the only Jim that could stand up to Dwight. And so those two kind of fell into place. And then Jenna Fischer walked in, and she was like amazing as Jenna, and it was I couldn't understand how she was doing what she was doing. She just seemed like a receptionist who was also super funny with the lines, but didn't seem like an actress at all. And so gradually we built the cast together, and then around that time, the show that Steve was on was starting to lose steam, and we got him in second position. We got tipped by Kevin Riley that maybe it was safe to hire Steve, so we hired Steve. And then we had this marvelous, you know, week of shooting the pilot and figuring out how to capture the tone of the British show. And that was really more of a producing challenge than anything, I think, or a directing challenge. It wasn't so much of a writing challenge. And then we got picked up for the first season. We got an additional 5 episodes, and I hired a writing staff. And I really took the time, like on King of the Hill, of reading a ton and meeting a ton of people. I hired a completely stellar writing staff. Paul Lieberstein, Mike Schur, B.J. Novak, Mindy Kaling were the core of the full-time writers. And, and it was like a kind of a dream come true, like of cast and writing and theme and property, and kind of the first time that I guess the mockumentary genre had been used. And in the same way that maybe The Simpsons got a lot of energy from being the first cartoon family thing, this was like a great reinvention of the workplace genre by using a mockumentary. And I knew that a mockumentary family show would be good too. And when we talked about spin-offs, we had a whole idea for that. But eventually we did Parks and Recreation first, and then Modern Family came out. And I was like, smart. I knew that would work.
And when you were hiring some of the writers, did you already know that they would also be on camera?
Yeah. Well, the very first person I hired for King of the Hill was Johnny Hardwick, who was also the voice of Dale. And he was a stand-up comedian from Texas. And the first person I hired for The Office was B.J. Novak, before any of the cast. And I knew that he was a great writer, and that he could be a character. And I love the idea of like writer-performers. And, with Mindy, I also went to one of her play of Matt and Ben, and I loved her scripts, and I thought she would be a writer-performer. I had no idea that Paul Lieberstein would be a writer-performer. He just was filling in at the table read and was really funny. And then the network president kept saying, well, you just give it to him. And then he kept saying, how about more of that redheaded guy? And so the character of Toby just grew and grew. And I think Paul is one of the best performers out there. I'm amazed by how good he is as an actor, but completely had no training. But yeah, and I kind of wanted to give it a handmade feel, so that it wasn't the factory assembly line sitcom and I had enough experience of TV now to know that when the writing staff and the actors are not in good sync, that you get a certain type of product, because the writers don't trust the actors to get laughs through behavior. And so they write jokes that have setups and punchlines in them. And then the actors throw out stuff when they don't understand how hard it is to be a writer. And, it's a dysfunctional setup often. And, the great thing about the Office format was it was a documentary, so if people were a little bit nervous, it made sense because it was a documentary. If you see the boom mic, it makes sense because it's a documentary. So all these things that might have been flaws in a normal production weren't flaws, and it lent itself to like a handmade feel. And what the great thing about that was that you could really pursue the comedy and the story and the parts that really mattered. And you didn't have to spend a lot of time on, the perfection of the production process. And so when we shot, out of every hour, 45, 50 minutes is actual working, is actual improvising, and the writers could, be on the set and throw out suggestions, and the cast are constantly doing it. And there isn't the same, enormous delays for lighting, and then one scene takes, a half a day shooting little pieces of it, And the camera operators became a giant part of the show too, in that they are often like characters. Since they are in the scene, I would give them direction like I was giving direction to an actor, and they would, instead of saying go to a medium shot, go to a close-up, I would say, oh, you didn't know that was going to happen, and you're really interested in it, and then they'll find out how to get there. I started directing on The Office, although I had done all the voice direction for King of the Hill. I hadn't, and I'd given notes on all the storyboards, so I'd been preparing to direct, but I hadn't actually, been in the DGA until The Office, and that was also really fun for me to have the, you know, the ability to play with the actors and the cameramen and all these other professionals that are, you know their stuff.
How was it to take, in terms of making it for an American audience?
Mm-hmm.
What kinds of things did you have to incorporate? What did you have to throw away?
Well, the interesting thing about adapting The Office was, so, you know, at first I was just, can I recreate the tone? And then in season 1, there was like, all right, let's not make the same mistake as coupling and use all the British scripts. Let's write all of our own scripts and make it all American. So starting on the second episode, the task was, let's do an American version of this. You know, by being Americans, you know, we made an American version. It wasn't incredibly difficult brain work to say to yourself, all right, well, the essence of the boss is that, you know, he's sort of tone deaf socially and keeps insulting people when he doesn't want to or whatever. What would that be like in the U.S.? Well, it might be more racial than class-based. And I mean, there's certain things where once you pose the question, you kind of know what the answer is. And so then kind of figured out how to do like the American version of the show in season 1. But then in season 2, we had a different challenge, which was like our ratings weren't great in season 1. And part of Americanizing it was, all right, to go the distance of an American show, you need to care about the lead characters. And the British show is, on some level, you care about the love story, but the Steve Carell character, you know, the David Brent character, is kind of a character study of a guy who is constantly making bad character choices. And, you know, part of what the change was for season 2 was how to make him have all the same comedic, you know, parts to his character, but also be somebody who you cared about and you rooted for. And when I started to realize that was the task, I had a list of all these things, these moments that I wanted Michael Scott to have on camera to like rebuild his character. And I realized it was very similar to the task that I had done in rewriting Hank Hill and taking him from being like a funny character to being kind of a lead. And so then I was like, oh, okay, I know what this is. I'm on like, I finally realized that what I was doing professionally for years would apply perfectly to this new thing. And I had a list of Michael Scott moments, like I wanted him to give good advice to somebody else, and that became the ending of Booze Cruise when he tells Jim to never give up. And I wanted other people to like rally around him, like that idea of we can pick on our brother, but if anybody else tries to, we'll all. You know, so that was like the essence of the Dundies. The first episode of the second season was that they're all making fun of Michael, but when he gets heckled in a Chili's restaurant, they all kind of protect him. And, you know, and there were all these different like moments like that were meant to. Oh, and then like in the episode called The Client, when Jan thinks he doesn't know what he's doing with this big sale, and then he closes a big sale, and it turns out he's actually a very good salesman. And you know, there was a lot of like small changes meant to kind of build him up, and we had to police his point of view a lot, so that we wanted him to do a lot of these insensitive things, but that he should always have a good, like in his mind, he isn't trying to insult Oscar when he says, "Is there something you'd rather be called than Mexican?" Do you know what I mean? He doesn't think he's insulting people. So we had to give a good intention to him in a lot of his situations. And that is difficult because you come up with the funny thing, and then it's really hard to find a good intention so that you can keep him on a drama story also, and, you know, not turn into a villain all of a sudden. You know, so that was like a writing challenge. But
what about some of the other characters, like Dwight, where you had there was also a fine line for what they could do?
What happened with the other characters, I think, was that first of all, we had more screen time than the British show, so we started to develop the side characters more. And then you're always looking for stakes in a story. And one of the things I had taken away from King of the Hill was stakes, motivation, turns, escalation. Those are the 4 things that I would write on index cards and put up all over the place because they kept coming up in the rewrites. And when you think about a very realistic show set in a workplace, the stakes are going to be personal life stakes, the ones that have the largest, importance, like who are you going to marry, who's going to break your heart. Those kind of things are real, and they happen to everybody in a small office. So once we started to really get into like the soap opera of everybody's personal lives, then the stories, I think, were really good because they had a lot of stakes for the characters, but they weren't very broad. If you want to try and give stakes that aren't personal to and have them be significant, then big things have to happen in the world that they're in, and then it starts to not be as realistic of a show. So that was, I guess how we started to get Dwight and Angela to have an affair, and the different and Ryan and Kelly, and we sort of started pairing off the characters more and got into their personal lives more.
And would you build those out over a season in terms of arcing?
Yeah, about half a season. I could only see about half a season ahead. So, during the pre-production, I'd have like a notion of where the first half of the season would go. And then, at some point, in the craziness of the middle of the season, we'd start to, like, ideas would come up and we go, oh, that's good. Let's chase that. Like, the big thing in season 2 was how quickly are Jim and Pam going to kiss or get together, and so we brought them together at the end of season 2, but then we started season 3 with Jim in a different city. And, that was like a fun thing that I think people didn't probably expect was going to happen, that he was going to move and we were going to invent a whole other workplace in a whole other city and follow his story and then merge them together again. And then the second half of season 2 was, all right, well, Jim's back in Scranton with his girlfriend from Stanford, but what does Pam have to do in order to deserve to be with him? And we felt like, okay, she has to become more assertive and confident. And so the arc for the second half of season 3 was Pam's, becoming more confident, like culminating with her walking across the coals and beach games and really saying that she wanted to be with Jim and stuff. And so, but like I didn't know that at the beginning of season 2. I knew the beginning of season 2 was going to be Jim's going to be in Stanford, and we were going to play that out until they were brought back together and he would have a girlfriend, but I didn't know the second half.
Once you knew that, would you let the actors in on it as well so that they could also
Well, there was a tremendous amount of like cross-fertilization, which again was one of the benefits of having actors who were improv comedians who also wrote. Like Krasinski's a writer, Steve Carell wrote episodes, they were also directed, and then the writing staff were acting. And the only drawback of having a writing staff that acts is that when the season gets underway, it's all great in pre-production, but when the season gets underway, suddenly you look around the room and half the room are on the set, and you're like, hey, wait a minute, guys, we need somebody to write next week's. So I kind of pulled back on writer performers after the first 3 squeaked out, but.
And in terms of the guest actors that came in, how were those?
Well, we didn't have a lot of. We didn't like stunt cast on the show, and that was like a decision to. Might have been a poor decision, but it was a decision that we kind of decided, like, this is a documentary, to be able to constantly say, like, this week, I don't know, some like for example, other shows, every week there'd be a different guest star, and that wasn't kind of what we were up to. So a lot of times Allison would bring in people, and a lot of times they were really cool people who she had identified in advance of anything. And for example, Ellie Kemper was somebody that she just brought in. She didn't know whether we needed her. We didn't have a particular role for her. She was just like, I think she's great. And, we met her, and I thought she was great too. And just wanted to do something with her. Catherine Tate, when we were talking about that spinoff of the Family Show, it was going to be Ed Helms living on a cul-de-sac. It wasn't a spinoff, but it was a mockumentary family show. The idea was Ed Helms living on a cul-de-sac with his wife, and his wife was Catherine Tate. Or at least that was one of the proposals for his wife. And Allison just had me meet with her like a general, and I thought she was so talented. Anyway, so eventually she ended up on the show. Again, I've forgotten your question.
We were talking about some of the guests that would come on.
Yeah. And then when we realized that Steve was going to leave at the end of the 7th season, at that point, Paul Lieberstein was running the show, and made a great effort to get Will Ferrell to replace him as the manager, which I thought was really smart because it was like something to look forward to, so that it wasn't just this feeling of loss that Steve was leaving. It was also like, oh, well, that's cool. We have this great guest star who will be there for a few episodes and kind of help us through that transition. And then, I guess recently we've maybe had a few more, like Roseanne is on next week as a guest star, which I was very excited about just because I really wanted to work on her show, and to get her to come to the show was really exciting.
When Steve was going to leave, did you think about ending this show, or?
Yeah, well, definitely could have ended it there. He didn't want us to end it. I think he felt very guilty about the idea, like if you're the first person to leave a cocktail party or a dinner party or whatever, and suddenly it's over and everybody leaves, you always feel bad. But, the show was really in a good place, I think. The writing staff was very happy and creative. The cast was gigantic and talented, incredibly talented. And, there was a sense that we had a very deep bench, and that if Steve wasn't around, maybe some of these other guys who hadn't had the opportunity to have A stories would get a chance to have them. And, Ed Helms was there, and Craig Robinson, and Rainn Wilson, and John Krasinski. Ellie Kemper. This is like in addition to the guys who started with the show who should have more screen time, there was like a lot of juice in the cast. So kind of felt like it would be a good idea to keep going.
And overall, how were your dealings with NBC?
Well, they changed. Like it started off, it was Kevin Riley, which was great, and he was had a lot of good notes. And then I think after him, Ben Silverman became the head, who was my partner on The Office, and had hired me to do the show. And so that was great. Obviously, he was very supportive, and that's the time that he really wanted a spin-off or another project. And so Mike Schur and I developed Parks and Recreation to meet his desire for another show. And then that sort of was part of my career as the showrunner of The Office. Was I started off as a showrunner, and then when Parks and Recreation got underway, I ran that as well as The Office. And then there was a year where I was trying to stay on top of both shows, and Mike was running Parks with me, but I was still also running that and locking all the scripts and cuts and everything for that show. So there was one season where I did something like 56 episodes of TV, and it was a lot. So then after that, season 7 and 8 of The Office, Paul ran without my constant need to lock everything and be there. Although I was still going to all the table reads and participating, and same with Parks. But after that one season of 56, I was like, I can't keep that up. And then I came back to run The Office full time for the last season.
Would you like to talk about it? I don't know if you want to do it now or if you want to wait a little bit. we like to talk about the last season and the finale.
Yeah, well, the last season was, I think that after Steve left, we didn't know, like, the shape of the show.
Actually, can we hold for a second? Can we?
After Steve left, there was, in terms of what the show was going to be like, we took a stab at making it more of a Simpsons-style show in the sense that there weren't arcs. So season 8, there for a while there weren't really arcs. There was sort of the arc of Andy becoming the manager in the beginning, and then there at the end of season 8 there was an arc of him going to Florida to get Aaron, which I thought was very successful. But like in the middle of the season, I think it was more episodic comedy, and there wasn't much activation of Jim and Pam or anything. And so when we decided to do a final season and to call it the final season, and I came back for that, one of the things I wanted to do was to go back to having arc. Having, like, you can't scramble the order of the episodes because you want to find out what's happening next to Jim and Pam and stuff like that. And I think that the show was really built for that, personally. I think that is part of, as part of the DNA of the show, is just to care, to do stories where you really care about the dramatic aspects of it as well as the comedic aspects. And so we had this idea of, like, all right, well, I never wanted to have any trouble between Jim and Pam once they got together, because I felt they're soulmates, and it would be kind of cheap to keep manipulating, like, other temptations or affairs or whatever. I didn't want to ever go there. But for the last season, we were like, well, that's great. We have this potential energy built up in the fact that Jim and Pam, have this great relationship, but it hasn't really been tested by reality. And so that was kind of the theme of this season. And John had this story about his brother who had kind of done a startup and had to travel a lot, and that kind of became the way that their relationship was tested, and that he started up this new job in Philadelphia. And you don't know what the ending is because you're filming it with 6 episodes to go. But you can always come back, I guess, and get, shoot my describing the ending. But, but so that's season 9. But there was a point where I wasn't sure whether it was going to be the last season or I was going to try and relaunch it. And part of the relaunching was kind of finding new versions of the old characters. And then when I decided not to do that it would be better to go out with the original guys and to actually give an ending to the show. And but I still liked the idea of hiring Clark Duke and Jake Lacey. So they were these 2 new guys that got hired and kind of were like a little ding, like a little bell for Jim and Dwight to realize how long they'd been in the same job, and that maybe it was time to start thinking about what to do or where to go.
And we also see the documentary part of it starting to come into play on lots of levels.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. That was something that we had pitched a long time ago. Like when the writers came up with ideas, I would mentally put them in categories of, like, that's too soon, that's too, well, let's get a lot of in-character episodes before we do something that's really out of character or whatever. And then there was a whole bunch of, like, really conceptual, kind of cool ideas that we would come up with. And I'd say, I don't see how we can keep the show going in the same format after that's happened. Like, once we see the boom operator, it's weird. I felt like we would be close to the end of the series once that happened. But we had, like, a bunch of fun ideas like that were kind of saved for doing an ending. And that was one of the reasons I wanted to do an ending, was to try and get to some of those. And the interesting thing is that I think a large portion of the audience has forgotten that it's a documentary. I mean, we're constantly reminding them. Like, I wrote Goodbye Michael, Steve's last episode. One of the moments in it is he takes his mic back off and hands it back and says, when is this thing going to air? You're going to remind me when it's going to air, right? So there are a lot of reminders, but still people, I think, a lot of people think that it's just a storytelling convention that the characters are talking to the camera. But I always thought that the documentary portion of it was like really a cool way to feel that it was real. And so part of what's kind of interesting is to see that these seeds of, the fact that it was a documentary kind of starting to matter in the storylines. And yeah, that's where we are now. Last week's episode, promo started to air for the documentary. So.
And when did you? I will ask you what it is, but when did you come up with that last whatever is
the
going
finale?
to happen?
Well, season 2 or something, I had an idea for the finale, and it was kind of something that I thought I was going to be aiming at the whole time, and that the original idea has kind of become one of the acts of the finale, but other things that have come up have become larger than that original idea. But that's kind of the fun of this show, is that every time you think you are like the puppet master or whatever, you run into all these other talented people who love the show and have their own opinions. And, it becomes like you got to have the flexibility to change direction. And I feel like I learned a ton from Steve Carell about improv. And, we talked about how, my acting days were very limited. And part of that was because, of sort of self-consciousness or whatever. And Conan was the one doing Groundlings lessons. But through working with Steve, I really got an understanding of what improv was, like the spirit of it and the flexibility, the creative flexibility of it. And it is like a philosophy that allows you to participate with other people in a production and take the best of their ideas and kind of all be going to one outcome. But so I brought stuff from my side for what I wanted in the finale, and part of it's in there, but a part of it is just the process working and all the other people's ideas coming in and leading to something else. And as long as you're like in there, you're still kind of directing the process. But
were you happy with it?
Yeah, I haven't edited it yet. I have a 82-minute rough cut. And right now the big question is, can I get it down to time and not lose anything great?
So it'll be like an hour? Or?
It's supposed to be an hour, but that's a 42-minute. That's 41 minutes. And 82 minutes is exactly double. Is there somebody behind me? No? All right.
Okay, we're back on. Yeah, you were talking about editing the final episodes.
Yeah, well, one of the things I love about this mockumentary format is you can shoot a ton. And in the same way a documentary might have hundreds of hours of footage and then gets edited down, you do the same thing here. And the show is really made in the editing room. I could do like many, many different types of shows. And I love the editing process. We have fantastic editors. And it's like another form of writing, is to sit in there and to realize, like, if I took that out, that scene that I thought was so important, it's a different story. The mind will connect the remaining scenes into a story. It's not the story that I thought was the story. It's a different story. It might be better. And so constantly subtracting different elements and seeing like, oh, now that's the new story is without that. Or now if it ends 2 beats before I thought it was going to end, what does that mean? Okay, that has a feeling of an ending now. And I don't know, it's really fun. I think about The Sopranos. When I think about endings, like I love The Sopranos. And a lot of times with The Sopranos, you wouldn't know what the story was until the ending. And then when it ended, you were like, oh, that's what the story was, because of where they chose to end it. And I think about that one episode where his therapist is on vacation, and he goes around and he's trying to have the sort of deep conversation with all these other people, these inappropriate people like strippers and, other mobsters and stuff. And he kind of fails, and he goes home and he's kind of sad about it. And then his wife wakes up and makes him breakfast, and just as they start to talk, it's over. And you're like, why didn't he talk to his wife? That's who he should be talking to, but you didn't really know what the point of the story was. And so, in the editing room, a lot of times you suddenly realize the point of the story when you've pulled out an element. and it changes. Like we just did one. I just locked an episode yesterday, and I dropped a beat, the first beat of the Jim Pam story, and I felt like, oh, it's actually cooler now because I didn't anticipate what the second beat was. It's coming out of nowhere.
Okay, do you think fans will be happy with it?
Yeah, I hope so. I hope they'll be happy with the finale.
Will it sort of be like The Sopranos in the sense of, there's going to be like a love-hate kind of thing, or, some
No, well,
camps
I'm
or the
trying to be
pretty-
more people-pleasing than the Sopranos finale, but there's a lot of, there's a lot of closure in it, and a lot of it is very personal closure in terms of, I worked in a lot of the staff in acting bits, and there's a lot of like this whole season has been a lot of closure. And one of the cool things we did was there's a episode where Pam goes to Philadelphia and she interviews for a job, and she thinks maybe she'll take a job in Philadelphia, and she goes to become an office manager, and she meets with Bob Odenkirk. And Bob was the guy who would have been Michael Scott if Steve hadn't done it. And so I always, in my head, was like, I wonder what the show would have been like. So it was very cool to have her go check out this alternate reality. And the guy, one of the contenders for Jim, was an actor named Michael Weston. He's in that office too. So this was like this alternate office reality at this realty office in Philadelphia. But nobody gets that. I mean, there's nobody who knows that these were people that we had screen tested.
Okay, going back to the beginning, just a couple of questions. Why Scranton? How did that play into it?
Well, the decision to set it in Scranton was, there was like 7 different reasons. So it's hard because I can't point to one. I was reading John O'Hara short stories, which are set in Scranton around the same time. It felt like it needed to be a northeastern city that was recognizable, but not too close to a big city, so that we weren't tempted to constantly go to the big city. And then I got a bunch of Valentines at the drugstore, and they were printed in Scranton, Pennsylvania by they have a paper industry. And anyway, and then we were sort of flirting with it, and when John Krasinski came over to shoot the pilot, he stopped in Scranton with some of his friends who had a little homemade doc crew. They had a camera, and they shot a bunch of interviews with real paper executives that he wanted to use for his acting, and they also shot all the exteriors that are used in our main titles. And when we saw the footage that he had of paper executives in Scranton, we were like, this seems very realistic. Let's stick with Scranton. And it's been very good. We've had a good relationship with the city.
And the name Dunder Mifflin?
Well, I just made that up. And I wanted it to sound kind of like dunderheaded, or, something that included a slightly, foolish feel to it, but then also kind of felt like maybe you heard it before, like it was maybe a realistic, at least, company. And then it turned out that Mifflin is a huge name in Pennsylvania history, which I didn't know. And there's a Mifflin Avenue in Scranton. But I didn't know that. It just came out of the subconscious, I guess. Yeah.
And what's been your favorite episodes or moments?
Well, I mean, it's so hard to pick a favorite episode. I loved so many of them. I really couldn't say. I loved... one of the ones I loved was, I guess it's called Business School or Business Trip. It was, Brent wrote it and Joss Whedon directed it, and it was the one where Pam has an art show and nobody comes, and then Michael is teaching business school and doesn't do a great job, and Jim convinces Dwight that he was bitten by a bat and has turned into a vampire. And but it has such a great ending when Michael shows up to go to Pam's art show, and is really enthusiastic about a picture that she's done of the office building. So I think that's like a gem of an episode. But there's a lot of really good ones, I think.
Okay. Back on. How involved were Stephen Merchant and Ricky Gervais in the rest of the series, or was there no involvement?
Well, Stephen and Ricky, by having an existing show in England, really said all that they needed to do, in a sense. Like, they weren't involved in the day-to-day, but I could always go take out the tape of the show and, get a understanding of their point of view on something. And they were very helpful in the beginning. Like, I would ask a lot of questions, and I used to email with them in the first season. But I think they really said what they had to say with their show.
And do you think the show, in your mind, met your expectations?
Oh, the show completely exceeded my expectations. I mean, I had the most fun. Yeah, to be able to go 9 years was amazing. And I said this at our wrap, but when we did the pilot, I loved the pilot so much, and it was including, I think, the actors, it was one of the creative highlights of all of our careers at that point, just to do this kind of a style where it was so improvisational, and it was so loose, and it was so behavior oriented and realistic and everything, and we all just really loved doing it. And at the end of the pilot, I remember saying to everybody, if this is all we get, then this is great, this is fine, And then at the end of season 1, I had the same remarks. It was amazing. We got an extra 5 episodes. I mean, it doesn't look like we're going to get picked up, but if this is all we got, then what a blessing to have had the experience. And then for it to become very successful and to go for 9 years, it's completely, exceeded expectations. And, very just happy and grateful to have had the experience.
What do people say to you the most about the show when they meet you and find out?
It's remarkable how many people say that they watch it with their kids, or they watch the whole family watch it, or they watched it when they were in the hospital. I get an awful lot of that, and people seem to derive a lot of benefit or comfort out of watching the show, and it's very cool and meaningful that's happening. You're asking about the legacy of The Office. Well, when we were trying to decide whether to bring it to NBC, there was a feeling of a little bit of a suicide mission to bring it to NBC because, as I said, Will and Grace was a prevailing show, and there was a lot of very loud multi-camera shows on. But I felt like if it would be worth it just to nudge the boat of American comedy a little bit in a direction towards Larry Sanders and the kind of shows that I really loved. And so if there's a legacy, I think we did kind of nudge the boat a little bit, because you see subsequent shows, Parks and Recreation, Modern Family, there's seems like there's more single camera shows, and there might be a little more, I don't know, there's stuff where the jokes, you have to kind of lean in to see the jokes. You aren't told where they are by bursts of laughter, which I like. I mean, I'd like to do a multi-camera at one point, but I know it's not in my wheelhouse really. But I like how it's sort of dry. Like there's a great essay that Mark Twain wrote about how to tell a story, and he talks about storytellers that really encouraged the audience by kind of laughing along with them, versus storytellers that are more deadpan and kind of dry, and they wait for the listener to figure out where the joke is and laugh on their own. And I think as a TV show, The Office is kind of like a drier show, which I think is a very legitimate, Mark Twain approved form of storytelling, and deserved to be on TV.
That's a good answer. Parks and Recreation.
Yeah.
Okay, talk about how that got started, how the idea came to you.
Yeah, well, basically, the idea, the genesis of Parks and Recreation was Ben Silverman coming to me and saying he wanted a spin-off of The Office, and I felt like spin-offs seemed a little cheesy, sort of. I was worried it would hurt the original show, but I wanted to come up with another show, so I made a deal with him that we would do another show. I would do another show, and I went to Mike Schur, who's on the Office staff, and said, would you like to create a show with me? Because I felt he was very ready to do that. And so we would meet at Norm's on the corner, which is like my second office, and in the mornings. And we had all these ideas. And one of the ideas was like a family mockumentary. We knew we wanted to stay within the mockumentary. And then the other idea was, all right, the Office is about the private sphere. What about the public sphere? Why don't we do a mockumentary about public life? And this was sort of during Obama's first campaign, and it was in the news constantly, and Hillary was running. And so these were like our ideas. And then Mike pitched it to Amy Poehler, who he had known from Saturday Night Live after me. And she loved it. And once you get a star like that you have the opportunity to work with, I felt like she was, there were three legends of Chicago improv. It was Steve Carell, Amy Poehler, and Tina Fey, and two of them already had shows. And so to get like Amy Poehler was amazing. And I don't know if that's Chicago improv, but anyway, so when she got on, we decided, we're going to go with the public sphere one. And we developed it to be in a small government, that would be able to tell stories about the bigger one, but not, And in a sense, it's a little bit of a merger of King of the Hill and The Office, in the sense that it's a mockumentary and it's a small thing, but it's kind of like a weird, it's set in Indiana, and it's kind of small town, and it's got like a lot of kind of Capra-esque feel to it. And we also had a similar trajectory there, in the sense that we got the comedy first, and had written the first season with Amy's character being very comedic, and then had to go through a very similar process that we did with Steve of, all right, she's kind of a dope. How do you make her a lead? How do you up her intelligence, and so there was a few tinkerings there to season 2, and I think we kind of really figured out the show more in season 2, although I like season 1. I enjoyed that enormously. The cast is fantastic, and we put it together similarly with Allison Jones, and I directed that pilot and had all these theories on set design that I wanted to work out, and the murals and stuff, and putting color and colorful stuff in the background, and so that's been like a great experience too.
Talk about some of the storylines and also the ensemble cast itself.
Of Parks? Yeah. Well, we had Aziz first on that show. We knew that we hired Aziz first because we knew we could put him in any project, and we could write a great character for him. So I think actually we had him before Amy, and he would have worked on any of the versions of the show that we were discussing.
Was it always going to be a female lead?
No. It wasn't always going to be a female lead. But it felt good to have it a female lead, because we also realized that we were doing a mockumentary, and we were building it around a really central character who had a lot of foibles, and we didn't want to be compared to The Office too much. That same desire to go find a new area. So, we thought a female lead would open up new stories and wouldn't resemble it as much. To the point where I knew I didn't want to do blinds, because it would look exactly like The Office. So I had the windows at the City Hall have those chicken wire, mesh inside the glass. So you'd still kind of be aware of it when you were spying through it, but it wouldn't look like these horizontal bands and everything. And we had Rashida as a character who had been on The Office, season 3, and Chris Pratt had started off as like the bad guy who he was was the bad boyfriend who we expected to dump after a couple of episodes, but he was so funny and winning that we rewrote that arc, kind of pivoted and made him a cast member. And then the Ron Swanson character was, had a lot of sort of like Dwight Hank Hill energy in him. He was strong, conservative person, and partly based on Mike and my research. We had done a lot of reading about local government, and we read this guy named Frank's books. He's he writes about land use in Virginia, and and there was a lot of kind of interesting stuff that came up when we did our research, and we talked to city planners, and we found out about the Dirty 30 in Malibu, where this sort of secret cabal of people who run that town, and all these interesting things. And one of the things that we came up with was, well, it seemed like there was people, maybe it was a Bush era thing, of people in charge of the EPA who didn't believe in the mission of the EPA, and people put in charge of these government agencies who didn't really even believe in them. So we thought, all right, let's get a libertarian who's in charge of the Parks Department, doesn't believe in government at all. And then when we were in Burbank and we were doing some research with their city planners, one of them said, "Oh yeah, my husband is a libertarian and works for the government and doesn't believe in the government's, business being in the division that he manages." So we're like, "Oh, that's real."
And one of the stories that's played out over last season, it was Leslie's relationship with Ben.
Yeah. Well, Ben wasn't a character in the beginning. Ben got added season 3 or end of season 2.
With that in mind, or did that? Well,
the initial desire was for the Mark Brendanowitz character to be the love interest for Leslie Knope. But the backstory was not good for her intelligence, because she had created, out of a one-night stand, she had created this entire relationship with him. So every time she kind of looked like she was going to get together with him, it made her seem stupid, like making a poor choice. So we unfortunately kind of wrote them into a dead end. And then we had a really good relationship with Louis C.K., who played a cop in the neighborhood, but then he wasn't free to continue because he had his own show. So, so there was definitely a need for another romantic cast member, and so he came on.
Do you have any favorite episodes so far? Is this it? Okay, actually, let me